Yeah. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah. It's very rainy and dark in Dublin today, so it seems like it is rainy in Zagreb as well.
Yeah, it's raining in Zagreb too. I think we should start. So I want to welcome everyone on our session 6, Inequalities in Scholarly Communication. The plan for this session is that I will give you a very short introduction, then I will give the floor to our speakers and panelists, and I will, of course, I will give short introduction also about our panelists too. The broad spectrum of open science methods like open access publishing, self-archiving of research data, preprints, postprints in open repositories, digital platforms for sharing research data, social networks, blogs, podcasts, shed light on the lack of diversity in scholarly communication. From issues of gender inequality to the lack of ethnic, race, language, and other diversity in our workforce, there is increasing awareness that we are not a good example of inclusivity. Publishing is truly a global enterprise, yet the diversity is not reflected in our collective demographic. So we will speak about how to introduce equality, diversity, and inclusion in scholarly communication. And I would like to introduce you our panelists. Laima is assistant professor at School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. She received PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington. Her research interests are in areas of philosophy of information, social studies of science and technology, inquiry methodology, and scholarly communication. Lai's recent project investigates intended and unintended consequences of systematic storage of information, focusing on academic databases. Cassandra Gould van Praag is coming from University of Oxford. Her background is in basic biological sciences, particularly human biochemistry, genetics, and immunology. During her study, she was awarded with first-class honors from the University of Brighton. She has a master's degree in cognitive neurophysiology, and she completed also PhD in informatics at University of Sussex. Cassandra is active in engaging research community to actively participate and contribute to the open science infrastructure at University of Oxford. She also works between departments to develop open science policies and recommendations. Alesia Zuccala is an associate professor at the Department of Communication, University of Copenhagen. Alesia's research specialization is in the field of scholarly communication, bibliometrics, and research evaluation. In recent years, she has focused on the evaluation of research outputs in the social sciences and humanities. And Andrea Reyes Elizondo is a researcher. Andrea, hopefully I pronounce it right, is a researcher at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, where she works on projects related to research integrity, like SOPs for RI, where also our colleagues from School of Medicine at University of Split collaborate too, and academic research system. She is also PhD candidate at the Leiden University Center for the Arts and in Society, working in the history of reading under supervision. I will just mention Adriaan van der Wiel, and Adriaan was invited speaker at PubMet conference, PubMet 2019, as I remember. Andrea holds a Bachelor of Art in Communication Science and Dutch Studies and Master in Book and Digital Media Studies. Since 2019, she co-chairs the board of the Dutch Book Historical Society. I will now give the floor to Laima.
Thank you so much, Jadranka, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference, which I have actually attended a few times. So very, very delighted to be back here. And this particular topic that you have accepted as a for panel discussion, and I really look forward to our panelists to talk about, in their own domain, in their research areas, how say open science and how bibliometrics are addressing different inequalities. So how I will be organized this particular panel, I suppose, I will give a very brief introduction to why I actually find this topic very, very interesting, and just a little bit about what I've been doing, and then I'll pass on to the panelists for them to talk about their work. And then I think in the meantime, if the audience has any questions, you can pop into the chat, and then maybe we will ask 1 or 2 questions right after each panelist presentation. And then, however, we will have more time together after all the presentations, and then we can discuss the topic. So hopefully this works. So as Jadranka has introduced me, I'm from Ireland. So I think it is also very interesting to actually have, we have different regions as well to think about these topics. So this is what I observe. If you actually disagree on certain things, please feel free to voice. This is what's not going on in our country or in our regions or in our research systems and so on. So this is what I'm observing. At the moment, what is called the changing landscape of scholarly communication. It is kind of cliche, but at the same time, I also feel like this is very real in the sense that I really started doing some research about research metrics, journal impact factor, and so on, maybe about 5 years ago. And I think since then, things have been changing very quickly in the whole landscape of scholarly communication. And in one way or another, yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you. Could you put your slideshow full screen? Yeah.
Okay, does it work?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So all of these changes can be actually making how we actually publish, who can read, and so on. More, is it creating more equality, or is it actually creating more inequalities? So that's the rationale of the topic of today. So, for example, currently there's the responsible metrics movement. I don't know whether people would be happy to call it a movement, but definitely we are actually seeing more and more universities becoming signatories of DORA. So in the sense that why we are doing that, because we want to actually create more equalities or inequalities amongst scholars, productivity, or what we call impact, how we actually think about what kinds of research are impactful, and whether that's actually a just judgment. Okay, so inequality could be actually think about it as injustice, but I'm not going into that very philosophical discussion here. And then when we think about that, even actually when, you know, a university has signed DORA. So the most recent examples of what was going on in University of Liverpool as the signatories of DORA, they still actually use metrics to actually design a list of redundancy. So this will be some of the things that we actually really think about, you know, whether the responsible metrics movement can provide as a solution to inequality in scholarly communication. So another thing that's been really going on, and I'm sure most of our audience will know about, is the Plan S and open access mandate in, you know, that a lot of funding agencies in Europe at least has signed up, that to make sure publications who are actually funded to be made immediately openly accessible, whether that's going to be through transformative agreements or green open access. But at the same time, you know, again, we are asking those questions, whether this is actually going to create more equalities or inequalities in our environment, in the sense that, you know, when those who get funded will be provided the funding to actually publish open access and making their research outputs more easily accessible, versus those who are not funded or who are in the regions or in the universities that does not have the bargaining power to get what is called a transformative agreements, and what happens to all the researchers in those universities and regions and so on. And there are also kind of the movement between, you know, whether we will look into research impact more or societal impact more. You know, again and again, I think every one of these different things that's going on in the scholarly communication landscape, when we actually think about, so in sociological terms, it could be enabling and constraining at the same time when we actually think about diversity, inclusion, and you know, all of those topics. And you know, and there are other things when we think about, is that when we think about inequalities in scholarly communication, some of the inequalities can be actually systematic inequalities. So in the sense that it is not just in scholarly communication, it is not just in academia. So when we think about the disparities between gender, between different ethnic groups, between race, or the discrimination against people of different gender identities and sexual orientation, those are systemic inequalities that's actually reflect in academia, and that's actually, however, at the same time, you know, all of these things can be mediated, can be actually we're not, when we use metrics or when we use open access, we might not be actually the tools that we are using, are we actually making, you know, a pushback to these equalities to actually make an example? Like, in the sense, making an example is not the right phrase to do so, but really think about, you know, how we actually use these tools or research policy to make, you know, scholarly communication more fair and just, and then that will actually lead the way to think about systemic inequalities also in our society. So and another inequalities that we are seeing a lot, and maybe we haven't talked about it a lot, is about precarious contracts. I think very, very much so in the UK. It is increasingly common in Ireland as well, and I don't know other regions, in the sense that, you know, people who has gotten their PhD, they are getting their postdoc positions, but maybe they might be in the postdoc positions for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, without any kind of guarantee of where they can actually, you know, stay and work and having the benefits. So it is another kind of inequalities altogether, but it is very true. So these are some of the things that's kind of in my mind to really think about, you know, how do we address this issue, and whether openness will be just equal to public and common good or not. All right, or there are actually kind of like, actually there's a caveat, you know, when we actually make things open, and how do we actually think about, actually even from this morning's panel, when we make everything public, what does it mean when actually some information is not supposed to be for public consumption, and people take it as soundbite to be disseminated as misinformation and disinformation. So my currently actually I'm working on actually thinking about something about platforms as well, thinking about research infrastructure, to think about how research infrastructure reflect what we now call the platform society, in the sense that a lot of times we think about social media, the internet, the word internet. We talked about that a lot. In the previous, panel, talk about, how Facebook is bad. They are helping to spread misinformation and disinformation, and they are also kind of like, they are only concerned with their own profits and don't have social responsibilities. But at the same time, we actually haven't actually really looked at, research infrastructure. Is that the same actually going on in the scholarly communication landscape when we are actually, freely actually provide our research profiles, data, and and so on in the for data analytics purpose. So it is very, very interesting that we have the ads from the commercial from Elsevier right before this particular panel. But this is actually a diagram that's taken from an article by Chen, Masoda, and Chen, to really look at the vertical integration of, how we actually given away in terms of how much some of the companies now actually they have different products, and Elsevier is not the only company. I do say that, there are multiple publishers, multiple companies who will be actually doing the same, that they actually have very, very many different products that dominate what we do and collect data about what we do, and then sell the data right back to research institutions. So that's my just to give a little bit background why I want to talk about this particular topic. And then now I'm going to pass on to our panelists and to get more insights. So Jadranka, we have Cass first.
Sorry, Alesia is first.
Okay, Alesia.
Oh, yes.
So I'll stop sharing here and I'll pass on to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Let me share screen. I'm very, very honored to be here. You can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, great. I'm super honored to be here. And again, I'll have to thank my students because they've given me time out from this from teaching, just to present some work that I've been doing with a colleague. Some of you know us from the Social Sciences and Humanities NRESH cost action group. So Jem and I have been looking at gender research in academia, a closer look at variables. And I think that this kind of corresponds with Laima's introduction, in which she was saying that there's, inequalities when you think about open access and publishing, etc. And I think this goes right back to the idea of variables in academia and how this affects performance. And what we found that, so a lot of research concerning gender disparities and women is kind of become a revitalized topic in science and technology studies in particular. And a lot of this research is building on the sociological tracking mechanisms from the early 1980s to late 1990s. And Athena Unbound is an excellent text that was published in 2000 and has great insights into women in academia. So what's happening when we look at, gender in academia is that, for example, the Danish Center for Studies and Research Policy has a group on gender equality and research. We've seen Nature studies where there's, information about global gender disparities in science. To my dismay, reports have said that Danes are at the bottom in gender equality. There's a commentary on the leaky pipeline at Copenhagen Business School, for example. Where are the female professors? And now I think it's quite good at the Roskilde University. There's now a Center for Gender Power and Diversity, which I'm actually hoping to join and visit in a week or so. So, and you know, I'm sure some of you have seen EU calls also for research proposals. So how to support research organizations to implement gender equality plans. But unfortunately, what has happened is we've had this COVID epidemic, and it just seems to be that we're seeing a kind of setback. So, for example, in Australia, they found that the female enrollment in universities dropped dramatically in 2020. There's a kind of decline in women's research production during this pandemic. And where are the women experts? A lot of them were missing from panels. And they're saying that coronavirus actually could hurt women the most, and it's kind of become a bit of a patriarchal pandemic. And so my colleague and I thought, well, you know, this isn't really a great thing that's happening. And we had a chapter we were working on, a book chapter. And before we actually finalized the chapter, we came out with this blog on the ideas that when it comes to gender inequality in academia, we actually know more than what can be measured. So I invite you to have a look at it. It takes about 7 minutes to read, and it sort of sums up some details of what we like to focus on in terms of gender research in academia, a closer look at variables in this handbook on research assessment and social sciences. So I just want to try to go through a few things about how we operationalize gender in research. And in science and technology studies, we use large bibliographic data sets, so we match names to gender. But then you have other fields in social science like psychology, where gender is sometimes blinded. So you blind to test for biases or stereotypes. But overall, gender can be treated differently depending on the type of investigation. But in academia, of course, we have to be concerned of variables when we study them. And so what is a research variable? So it's anything, person, place, phenomena that can be measured. And usually we use what's called proxy or instrumental variables, and they should be fit for purpose. So they should correspond well with some kind of object or concept to be evaluated. And over time, we've had this research going on in the productivity puzzle. So a lot of emphasis on women in academia has been centered around their productivity, because that's sort of measurable. You can get an idea of how much output women are generating and in comparison to men. So 1984, we had this productivity puzzle. 2013, we have this global gender disparity. So imbalances persist in research output. Why? It's going on again. 2018, another blog, a vicious circle of gender bias has meant differences in scholarly productivity. So my colleague and I were thinking, this does not seem right. Why is this persisting? And so we got to thinking about variables. Let's really, really think about them. So if we consider gender to be a kind of independent variable and productivity as the dependent variable, we have what's called intervening factors, right? That sort of come between us and our productivity. And, you know, research has been quite plain to say that in the US in particular, and this was in the 1990s, women professors were underrepresented in faculties of high prestige and overrepresented in low prestige schools where more teaching is expected. So teaching and service is kind of what you call the intervener that prevents or kind of alters how we see productivity. And intervening variables, however, can also be confounding. And a confounding variable is something that Tolman and his colleagues identified as hunger, for example, in their study of rats and maze running behavior. So they could measure, they could give food rewards and they can measure the running behavior of the rats, but they could not measure how hungry the rats were, and this was their confounding factor. So intervening variables can be confounding, especially if they're hidden and you cannot measure them, and they are in fact causal. So they are thematic, and actually when we're talking about gender in academia, they differ from myths. So for example, women are not as competitive as men. Academia is a meritocracy. These are myths, okay? Changing the rules of selection to foster equality will affect standards of excellence. These are myths. But what we are talking about here are not our confounders, rather socio-cognitive behaviors or moment-by-moment perceptions and judgments which can lead to cumulative disadvantages. So the question is, why should we bother to examine variables? Well, we need in general in academia, especially when it comes to studies in gender diversity and equality, we need more engagement with this concept of variable. And in the field of science and technology studies and in all academic fields, you cannot presume that variables attached to constructs are constant and universal. And in fact, gender as is socially and culturally situated. And because of this, we often see paradoxes. So the first concept is this idea of universality. So if you're going to examine publication outputs, career mobility, gender, all kinds of things in academia, you have to realize that there aren't universal conditions in various academic contexts. So for example, in Sweden, when you get your degree, usually the best students will remain in the same place that they're trained. But in US, the rule is exogamy. So you should, by all intents and purposes, leave your university, go out into the world and find a position elsewhere. And I remember also as a PhD student, I had no hope of staying at my institution. I needed to leave and go somewhere else. But all of this, variables somehow what you call introduce these paradoxes. So what happens is that a paradox occurs that when you try to get critical mass of women in academia, first there's sort of these invisible tokens, but as they become more identifiable, sometimes women are targeted for resistance. And this means that this idea of like, let's just promote women, get more and more women, this is mistakenly defined to apply cohesion. So as more women travel and take up positions around the world, as there's more mobility in academia, especially in the sciences, we find sometimes that national identity will take precedence over gender. So yeah, other paradoxes like, why do countries with high levels of gender equality have some of the largest STEM gaps? And there's also lots of research on this as well. But I guess to come to the closer point is that there are actually many underlying phenomena as variables that indicate or interact with the type of indicators that we use most in the fields of science evaluation or research evaluation. And so we've made this list, what we call our sort of cool variables to hot variables. And again, productivity, contribution, impact, innovation, these are all these sort of measurable variables. So we have these that you can easily sort of find a proxy for. Publication counts, for example, are used to measure women versus men's scholarly productivity. And then we have the variables that are on the lower list, what we call phenomena as variables. And these are like cognitive decision-making behaviors or ways of knowing in academia. So just to give you a few definitions or explanations, things like benevolent sexism, it's not really hostile sexism, where there's like a direct antipathy towards a person or based on gender, but it's more like complementary gender differentiation. So in productivity, you could say, well, men are assumed to be the leaders of a project, and that women are the followers. And that's so nice because women are so communal. So maybe men don't understand there's a kind of protective paternalism going on in academia that leads to changes. Things like parenting and family. My colleague Gemma Derrick has done wonderful research on models of parenting as a variable. So don't emphasize too much women as parental models, but more look at soul parenting, lead parenting, satellite parenting, roles that men and women take in parenting. Isolation would, this can often arise to what we call boys' clubs or gender homophily. And in the context of modern science, we can see that there's, maybe some conspicuous areas where you have manels or manferences at scientific meetings. In Rosalind Franklin's story, if you know her story, it's the quintessential example of isolation. She was in her lab and didn't have very much contact with her male colleagues because they were gathered together in pubs. At the Sharon Trawick has looked at beam times and lifetimes, groups of men in this Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. They had lunch in the cafeteria, built friendships, exchanged ideas. Most of them were men. And isolation today, we've come up with this idea. It could be kind of a result of what we call the sister form of the Matthew effect. And Matthew effect has been used in scholarship, and it distinctly refers to men. So whoever has this shall have more in abundance. And it's a male concept, right? And it came from Robert K. Merton in 1968, and it takes its name from this parable of talents in the biblical Gospel of Matthew. And so we thought, well, what isn't there maybe something, there's a Matilda effect, but isn't there kind of what you call Martha effect, where the story of the disciple in relation to a rabbi? So the sisters, Mary and Martha, and Mary's quite attentive to Jesus and focuses on his teaching. So it's like women need to be under the teaching and validation of an esteemed male. Moral self-licensing. We all like to think that we have equal ideas about people. We all like to think that we embrace diversity, but let us not self-license ourselves and give us a credential and say, oh yes, I work closely with a female colleague, or I work closely with a male colleague. Of course I'm not, sexist. Of course I understand diversity and gender equality, but sometimes we have to be in balance with ourselves and check what's going on. Gaslighting. So just pretending that when somebody of a particular minority or gender has an experience, do we gaslight that individual, or do we believe his or her testimony? So sometimes this happens where it's a cumulative disadvantage, where you don't believe the person and their testimony in terms of how they are experiencing academia. And this comes from a famous film called Gaslight. Here's just a great cartoon, a woman is yelling help and the man saying, oh, she's so high maintenance, this is gaslighting the situation. But what can we do about gender disparity? So, and our little rat here is still not hungry. Affirmative actions are known not really to work because they just sort of tend to create these unintended consequences where there's sort of pushback. Men and women actually need to work together, examine influence based on dominance and prestige, learn to recognize the power of powerless communication, and challenge assumptions about what makes a scientist powerful, authoritative, prestigious, especially in times of scarcity and competition. And I really like the work of Adam Grant, because he said the focus should be on relational architecture. So we should sort of merge together ideas of communal motives and agentic motives, and not sort of assign them to different types of persons or personalities. So this idea of that you have an architectural top-down view, motivational bottom-up view, and get it sort of in an integrated regulation. I really recommend, in fact, reading further on his work, especially in give and take, so the idea is that there's givers, there's takers, there are matchers. How do we achieve success? But something really happens when givers give and give and give. It actually spreads and cascades. So I have some what you call questions for discussion, which I think are really important. So for example, if you have certain phenomenological variables in an academic situation or academia or in scholarly communication, how do we actually identify if these confounders exist? So how do we identify or know that gaslighting, benevolent sexism, moral licensing, glass ceiling effect, how do we know that these exist? But how do we study it or seek to understand it? You know, maybe they're difficult to operationalize. Can we do this? And if not, what can we do about it on a micro or like an individual level? How do we take responsibility individually or a meso organizational / policy level to actually minimize its effect? So I hope that I can give you these takeaways. Thank you kindly for your attention. I also want you to consider contributing to our special issue and DPI publications. We have an issue on gender research at the nexus of the social sciences and humanities. So if you have any questions, you know, please don't hesitate to contact me or Gemma. Thank you. I'm sorry, I probably ran over a bit of time, but.
No, thank you, Alesia. So I suggest if you can stay a little bit on our session. So
I will stay.
When you hear your students calling you, then you can leave us. So
I will. Yeah, I will have to say something, but yes, I'm planning to stay until probably 12:50. I hope. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, it was quite long. I apologize, but we've done a lot of.
No, it was great. So, who is the next speaker?
Who wants to come next? Cass? Yeah.
I'm happy to go.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for the invitation to contribute to this. This is slightly outside my normal realm of expertise in terms of like the publishing, but in reflecting on the topics of discussion, I realized how very close my own work is to this field of scholarly communication and publishing. And I think about my outputs, and then my efforts are mostly focused around generating the outputs. But I'm encouraged now to think further about how those outputs are sort of received and presented to the outside world. So thank you for helping me to think about these things. So I've got a few slides that I'll show in a few minutes, but I just wanted to first sort of set the scene from what my background is and my position and the work that I try to do. As was said in the introduction, I've got an incredibly varied background. It sounds quite scary hearing it back, saying that I've got my degrees in biochemistry and immunology, and now I focus mainly on neuroimaging and brain analysis with fMRI. And I've recently transitioned from a research-only post into something which is more research support, and that is around community engagement with open science. So we're developing lots of new infrastructure at Oxford to help our researchers share their neuroimaging research outputs. So that's their data, also their publications, obviously, but also their code and things like their materials for data collection and analysis. So we're really trying to encourage our researchers to think about their research outputs as more than just the paper, but everything that contributes to the paper, to collecting that data, and helping them receive credit for those other things that go into producing the research paper. And that not only gives them, in a kind of an academic sense, more weight on their CV, but it also means that more people can benefit from the skills and talents that they put into creating those research outputs. So the idea is to be transparent in the way that their research is conducted and analysed, but also to enable other people to benefit from the efforts that they put into it. So that's my role: help people get excited about open science. And also, in developing all of this new infrastructure, we've got a lot of policies that we need to devise, particularly with brain imaging data. There's some real complexities around participant privacy and how we ensure that the data that we are responsibly the custodians of, how we can share that in a way that doesn't impact the privacy of our participants, because everyone's brain is unique. It's much the same as sort of genetic data in that way. So there's a lot of new ground that we're covering, and it's engaging with lots of different parts of the university, which is both scary and exciting and laborious and wonderful. So it's a complex task, but I enjoy it very much. And then I deliver a lot of training around reproducibility and open science, so helping people write reproducible code and teaching them things about the values of digital object identifiers and licensing, and how this can be beneficial to them and their research. And more recently, I've taken a strong interest in UK government policy around research culture and research integrity. There's a lot of energy behind those two sort of buzz themes at the moment in the UK, culture and integrity. And the government has started to create a number of committees and panels about asking academics what's going on with research integrity in the UK, and what can we do to help support academics show where the integrity is high stakes, and also what happens if things fall down by the wayside. But the thing I think which speaks most to what we're discussing on this panel today is the work that I do around EDI, equality, diversity and inclusivity. So I've got a few slides that accompany when I give talks around EDI and open science. So I'm just going to try and set up my screen share now. There we go. So hopefully you can see my slides there. Perfect, thank you. Forgive me, I'm going to be looking at the wrong camera for just a second. So the basic premise around open science, in my view, as how it relates to equality, diversity and inclusivity, is that your research is not reproducible if it is only accessible by people who are the same as you. So these slides just sort of very quickly illustrate that in a kind of a very low-key graphical way. So first, understanding what open science is. So open science is an umbrella term. It encompasses many different practices and interests, but the idea is to remove barriers around access to sharing of scientific resources. Now, those resources could be like the journal publications, but as I said, it also encompasses everything else that goes into producing research. So we're about removing barriers to sharing. And we can think quickly about what the barriers are to sharing scientific resources. They may be very tangible things like software that requires paid for licensing, or they could be very expensive hardware around the millions of pounds that is required to collect brain data, for example. Or they could be barriers such as time that it takes to prepare a research output for sharing, or they could be incentives and training and things that are the Matthew effect that was mentioned earlier. I found like I've not heard that term before, but the idea that people who have the money, for example, to provide training, then create a whole generation of people who know how to do this thing and then have more time to do it. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. The more money that you put into this, the more value you can generate and sort of then get more funding and things. So these barriers that are around the sharing of resources can be historical, and they can be the result of privilege and exclusion. So this Matthew effect, but also placed on the systematic inequalities that Lai introduced earlier as well. So as you said, sharing and open science enables others to extend and reproduce and verify your research findings. But poor inclusivity can limit the access and limit the number of people who can share and validate your findings. So the more people who have access, the more opportunities there are for robust replications and extensions. So the argument in general is that the more access you can enable to your resources, the more effort you can put into improving access, the more people can benefit to extend and verify and replicate your work. So it's good for the researcher, but it's also good for society and the people who are interested in our research. So these thoughts came to me from conversations with friends who said that they are pro open scholarship and they're pro inclusivity, but they weren't sure whether one necessarily implies the other. So my position on it is that yes, absolutely, they are inextricably linked, that your work is only reproducible if it can be accessed by people who are different to you in whatever characteristic and every characteristic. But also in like the longer version of this talk, I invite people to think about their positionality. So you do not work in a vacuum. Your work is influenced by your demographics and experience, and what opportunities and voices are missed by people who are different from you in some ways, being able to access and enter into the discourse. But then we also need to remember that as a moral argument, exclusion causes suffering, and what individually are we doing to contribute to suffering of millions of people? We could be talking about access in the global south, or we could be talking about the way we treat other people in our research groups, or our hiring policies or who we cite in our publications, or even the languages that we write in and the languages that we speak in, and for example, having captions on our videos and things like this. So who we exclude in our practices, and how is that causing suffering, and how is that detrimental to our practice of research? So that's really it in terms of my slides and my background. I'm really, as I said, interested in the opportunity to think about this as at the far end of publishing. You know, for me, publishing a journal, that is often the end of the research life cycle. And I think about everything that leads up to that in terms of how I support researchers, but I don't often get the opportunity to think about the publishing as kind of only another stage in our research dissemination. So thank you for inviting me to think about those things. I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say.
Thank you so much, Cass. This is really, really interesting in the sense that, you know, when we have to actually think about how open access is actually including someone and excluding someone, and how to actually reach out, I suppose the engagement and outreach, and I think there's a broader discussion in many countries about what is called evidence for policy or research for public policy, in the sense that we really actually, if we can actually make use of scientific findings to actually make a fairer and juster world, and doing all of that from not only scientific research, but also social sciences research. So very, very excited to the discussion at the end of the panel. So now I would like to invite Andrea to
if I may, Andrea, sorry, if I may, just before Alesia leave our panel, we have one question for you, Alesia. So from Elizabeth Totzifra, we found that women reviewers are more prone to self-censorship in scholarly communication, which makes it more difficult to initiate discourse on this issue. So, and also there is another question also related to role of editor, about the drop in activity of women in academia during COVID. Our experience as journal editors is that many women, when asked to act as reviewers, had to decline the task, saying that they need to take care of kids and work with them more than they normally do.
Yeah, this was a side effect of the COVID pandemic, and yeah, I think I don't know if that could be studied in some way or measured. And in fact, maybe if we could get data from journal editors, I would be fascinated to find out how many females accepted reviewer roles in the past, year and a half or so. But what was probably more disconcerting was the fact that the productivity levels of women were seen to have gone down. And what some researchers did was look at archive submissions, so submissions of preprints to archives, and that there were fewer submissions from women. So overall, you know, I guess the thing is that everything sort of suffered in a way, the productivity, no time for reviewing, and a lot of women were involved in homeschooling their children at home. And I mean, this was just a dramatic reality, but it has more to do with, you know, patriarchal systems and understanding. And the thing is that academia cannot, I guess the problem is that academia cannot set policies related to what happens in the home. That's the most unfortunate thing. However, we need to be aware of what happens. I think that's the most important thing. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time because I think I want to stay to be able to listen to Andrea. There was, I had a, so it was about editors not being able to recruit reviewers. And the other question, just briefly, if I can answer it,
yes, that female reviewers are more prone to self-censorship.
Oh, self-censorship. This I'm not sure. I'm not sure what is meant by that. I need a sort of bigger explanation of that.
Okay, maybe we will get better explanation from Elizabeth.
Yeah, but let's hear from, I would really like to hear Andrea speak.
Yeah.
Before I have to leave. So, and I guess I have to just leave you to discuss some things, yeah, after.
Thank you. And please, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alesia. Thank you, Cassandra and Jadranka. I don't have slides, so you will just have to see with our faces. So just very briefly, I'm a researcher in social sciences, so where we've been doing interviews with editors, publishers, but also with scholars for research integrity projects. And my other hat is I'm a book historian. And in book history, we've been having this conversation on diversity, equality, injustices. And this, so my comments that I'm going to give you now, they're going to be packed from both of these areas of what I've been getting from, it's mainly voices from the floor, what I'll be sharing with. So I think already Alesia and Cassandra mentioned it, some issues are how is, for example, open access funded, and also how are public, which is the same issue that has come with how are publications funded. So this is also a cause of, on the one hand, researchers are looking forward because then more things will be open access, more publications. But on the other hand is how is this funded and how is this recognized? So for example, in Latin America, you have many open access journals because we don't have a scholarly, we don't have companies like in the West that are busy with scholarly publications. It's mostly done by universities and faculties. So there, in a way, it has been easier to go through open access, but the fees for accessing the higher journals, the higher impact journals, that is an issue of concern, but also for the south of Europe. So the interviews that we were doing, researchers were also concerned for, are we going to get extra funded for that, or is it going to be taken from the funding that we are already getting? So this is one concern. And also before I go into the other discussions that we've been having, I think what it's important to think also is that why do we want this? So why do we want to have more voices? And I think Cassandra already touched upon this a little bit, is we are missing a lot if we're only having conversations and discussions in our echo chamber, and we're missing a lot of experiences and points of view. And also it's not fair. So this is one thing. So there are discussions on which small steps we can take and which bigger steps we can take, and which has also part of the questions that Alesia had. So I would say on small steps, there were suggestions from researchers from the Global South. For example, when you are reviewing an article from a researcher and you send back, hey, have you considered this and this and this literature? And they say, this comes from Marina Garone Gravier. She's from the Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas at the National University in Mexico. And she was saying, well, we don't have access very often to these chapters or publications that you're mentioning. So probably that's also why we did not include it. So if you're reviewing an article publication and sending it back, it will be also good to ask, do you have access to this? Have you checked this? Do you have access to this? And if not, share it. So this is also part of being aware of the differences in the system. Another point was to be aware of our own situation and how we are used to construct our scholarly discourse. So an observation, this was from Alfredo González Ruibal from the Instituto de Ciencias del Patrimonio from CSIC. He is an editor of 2 international journals, and he mentioned that how authors from the South tend to be more careful when they're proposing something in their article, whereas authors from the West are more like, bang, this is it. And then, so sometimes these differences on this discourse are seen by reviewers as, okay, what is your contribution, right? So there are these different styles on writing, but it also comes from, because authors from the South are also recognizing there are these differences in the power structure, right? Who am I to say what? I'm not an authority to say, bang, this is how it should be solved. So this is also to be aware in whatever part of the chain you are on publications, to be aware of these differences. So have introspection, aware of where we are, and reflexivity of these power structures. They're constantly there. Even if we try to say, I don't see color or whatever, it's not true. The system is there, the structure is there. Another point that was raised, this was during interviews with editors of journals that include articles from authors from the Global South, was the issue of translations. And this is a part that touches upon how are we going to have discussions in different disciplines when there are people. This also touches upon resources, because not everybody has had the opportunity to be excellent in English, French, or German. So you are writing maybe in Spanish for your own discipline, for your community, but you will have also insights that are interesting for the wider scholarly community. How do you do that? With a translation. But a translation is considered a duplicate submission. You cannot just have a translation added. So on top of having the article translator, you will have translated, you are asking from the author to put extra time to change the article so that it's a different article. And this is, again, extra money and time. So maybe this is something that this should be considered. I don't know if it's just only by disciplines or for the wider scholarly community, but if we really want to have much richer conversations in different disciplines, then we need to consider how can we include those publications in a language where we can all have exchanges. So this is another thing. I know that we consider them as duplicate because of how we count productivity and output, but maybe we should change the indicators and give more room to more different contributions. And so this will be a few steps on the individual level of what we can do. And then I'm going to go into what I think a panelist from the previous panel mentioned, activist role. So for the meso part, I mean, of course, on organizations and many universities are making plans for gender equality plans or inclusivity and their counselors. But I think it was Alesia who said, or maybe it was Cassandra or both, that it was, I mean, we're working in a system, we cannot change the system, right? And we're in this system that it's already set up in a way that these inequalities come to be. So I would say on this part, we need to be aware, so not just be aware of the system, but take also our role as citizens in whichever countries we are. So it's extractivism and exploitation of resources is not something from the past, it's still very much happening. So many industries operate in the Global South in tax-free zones. So this does not really, there's extraction of work and resources from these countries, but they don't get any benefits back from revenues, right? And many of the countries, so I'm dual national, so Mexico is suffering that, but at the same time, the Netherlands is participating and aiding in this tax evasion global system, right? And this tax evasion, at the end, it damages educational and science systems all around the world, because there's not enough funding for teachers, for libraries, for grants, for research institutes. So this is affecting us as humanity, because we are not having enough to allow for people to study everywhere. So I would say that as scientists and scholars, there's so much we can do in the area where we are, but as citizens, we should really pay attention to how our countries are behaving and demand changes for that, because we have all these goals for social change from the UN or from the European Union. Are you covering these? But if at the same time, we are evading or aiding on the evasion of taxes, and countries cannot get their fundamental systems funded, this is an issue. So I know this is we are not meant to talk about these kind of issues and we'll be neutral, but I don't think we can stay neutral at this point. So that's my small contribution without slides.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is really exciting. You packed a lot of things into that 10 or 15 minutes and a lot to think about. I just want to know, so Alesia has left, it seems like, but I really enjoy her presentation as well, like in the sense of women's problem. It has been a problem, but as you said, Andrea and Cassandra, you can jump in anytime in the sense of that systemic problems. Actually, in Ireland, it is very interesting in the sense that yesterday we just have the news that the OECD report Ireland in Europe will be ranked at the bottom in terms of investment in education. So I think a lot of people would not even believe it, but that would be the case. But it really kind of reflects. And then we also have this recently also the research that's talking about, comparative to the GDP, how much is actually invested in research. Because I think a lot of these issues that definitely, this is not a lot of times just not, we actually look in the broader picture, as you have mentioned, and the global imbalance of resources really actually feed into how we think about the scholarly communication landscape. So I am just looking at see if anyone has any questions there.
If I may return to this question of self-censorship. So yes, Elizabeth remind me that during our huge landscape study where inside as a part of Opera's P project, when we did a lot of interviews with researchers in different countries, asking them about their publication practices, we find out that women are not ready even to mention this gender bias in the interviews. So the conclusion was that there is a level of there is a level of self-censorship present. If you have any comment on this.
I could maybe jump in quickly. I mean, I don't know the study, but what we have seen in that there are other studies on disparities, whether it's racial, gender, or class, is that it's very hard to acknowledge that it's happening, because we are, that's the beauty of the system, where the devil, the best trick of the devil is to make us believe it doesn't exist. So we don't think that there is a, we want to believe that there is no bias on gender, because maybe it also related with the news, with national, international news, and how certain issues are covered. So, gender bias may be something more for other countries or other cultures, but not us. We're fine. So I think it's also this, we've bought the idea that it does not exist. So probably that's also more difficult to name it, I imagine.
I fully agree with you, Andrea. Yes, we have a question from Eva Grabaric-Jadranka. You have not mentioned the problem of scientists with disabilities. In Croatia, there are almost no conditions for them to be included in laboratory work or teaching.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something about that.
Yes, please.
So, a recognized pattern when we're talking about equality, diversity, inclusivity is starting, for example, with gender and then sexuality and then racial inequalities and then disability and neurodiversity often comes down the bottom of the list of just the sort of the order that people think about these things. I don't know exactly why that is, but we know that that's happening. And one thing that's been really interesting with COVID as a pandemic, as I'm sure you're all aware, is all of a sudden people that, for example, can't come into the lab every day because of pain issues or because they're immunocompromised, for example, have now been able to have the same level of access to academia as everyone else. And then also as I went through, I was pregnant and had maternity leave during the pandemic, and I was also able to access the lab in the sort of scientific discourse because all of a sudden we flattened this requirement about physical presence, and we're having all of these conferences. There's no way I would have been able to come to this conference had it not been online. So yeah, so what I'm seeing now in our university and other areas are people are saying, okay, the pandemic is drawing to a close, depending on who you're listening to. Let's all come back into the office. And I'm really kind of disappointed, and disgusted is kind of a strong word, but they're saying, okay, now everyone come back into the office. If you can't come back into the office, well, sorry, you're going to miss out again. So we've had this beautiful period where people with some levels of disability have been able to join in, and now we're just going to flip the switch and reverse that, and doing so intentionally. We understand the benefit that has been brought to so many people now, and now we're intentionally trying to exclude them again. So I really hope that there's a lot more awareness given to that, as it's like, now you can see what you're actually doing here. Now you can see how the value that you've brought to so many people to contribute, and now you're actually going to take it away from them. They've been asking for remote access for so long, and now you're going to take it away again. So it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves as an issue. And I certainly, as Andrea put so passionately, that we can't stand by on these kinds of things anymore. We can't just be passive observers of these things. I mean, you can. There's still the space to allow that, but now there's also a vocal group of people that are hoping to champion the inequalities in so many ways. And also, just speaking back to that issue of self-censorship, it all echoes these power imbalances. So the fact that, say, there's like an idiom of imagine what a mediocre white man would say, right? So if you're anything other than the middle class white man, then you might not used to be speaking in such an authoritative way, because you don't have the power behind you, the weight of history and colonialism and everything behind you. But imagine what a mediocre white man would say right now. Would he be doubting himself? Would he be censoring himself? Apologies to any mediocre white men in the audience. I'm sure you're all exceptional white men.
We have also one very interesting comment from Shelley Pranic from University of Split, that she is commenting on digital divide, where over 3 billion people in the world do not have internet access. So we are speaking about open access and changes in the scholarly communications, but a lot of people don't have even these primary resources on disposal. So yes, it's very interesting for me that when I listen all panels about diversity and inclusion, usually the perspective is shared from Western countries and global North, and much rarely we can hear the perspective from global South, and it's really important. It seems to me that we I try to invite to this session someone from Andrea, Mexico, or Brazil, but there's it was not possible because of the time zones. It's
just answering commenting on what Shelley was just saying, and this also goes back to Cassandra, was what she was raising, like what is open access including and excluding. So what we see a lot now is that there are lots of databases or data sources are being opened through research, and then people can just also download them and use them. And it's also not just downloading, but it's also the know-how of what to do with them. So I think there might be a bigger gap, even though we think we're opening a lot. So it's not only the internet connection, but do you have the software to use it and the know-how of what to do with these or how to interpret it? So maybe this, we think we're just opening up, and maybe we're just also maintaining a gap with the different guys.
I love that completely. It's we need to be mindful of the existing power structures and what are we replicating. We're attempting to move into a new era of open access, open everything, but we're in many ways just replicating the existing power structures. So it's I don't know what the solutions are, but it's something that I think is going to take much more close collaboration with people that are affected. You know, people in the global North, we can't just decide what the best model is and impose it. You know, there's going to be many different models that will benefit so many different people in different ways.
Thank you, Cassandra. And following Andrea's thoughts, it's also with all these open access movements turn in something completely opposite from the initial goals and what we want to achieve with open access. So we have, okay, now more people can access journals and books, etc. But on the other hand, with this APC-based system, we raised very present and very new kind of inequalities. So if you can afford to pay for one article 3,000 euros, which is a huge amount of money, even at the level of university here in Croatia, not at the level of department or something like that. It's so you are not able to make your research more visible. And of course you can deposit in preprint, and but Croatian, for example, Croatian research assessment system forced you to publish in formal journal with high impact factor, etc. Very, very well known story. So we are introducing with this openness new kind of problems and new kind of differences between global North and global South. I cannot see Lai. Did you see some further questions?
I am following the question there, and I just saw a comment from Andrea talking about ATM.
At the moment.
At the moment. I don't belong to the internet age, obviously.
Yes, this is
Yeah, with the vaccine access, definitely. Again, I think, you know, a lot of what you have been talking and Cassandra has been talking is really kind of replicating in the sense that it's not just information access. You know, when we're talking about open access, we're talking about information access, and the whole system now is really, you're seeing how the more, if I can use that term, capitalist way of, you know, pursuing that particular commercial interest in the West, or kind of protecting the empire, you know, in the West, maybe Northwest or global North. I don't know what term will be good to use. You know, I try to not use the term global South as well, in the sense that we totally understanding the global inequality. In the sense that, you know, once we have the money, okay, let's make everything open access and let everyone has the vaccine, versus in some places when they don't actually have the resources to access these things. So it is quite interesting in the sense that even with open science, like who benefit from the open data sets and the preprints, even though you have access to all the preprints, if you're in a region that doesn't actually have the resources to do research, it might not mean anything to you. You know, like you can learn as much as you can, however, you cannot actually produce research that would be up to that particular standard. So I think it is that might be a bigger problem that we can solve in scholarly communication, but definitely there are a lot of questions to think about.
It's good to know that it's not just a couple of people that are thinking this, that I think we're aware of this and we don't like it. And then probably we will not solve it, but I think we can try from our position. Yeah,
totally agree with you. And when you talked about, you know, we can see ourselves as a teacher, as a researcher, but also as a citizen, what we can do in our small part to try to change things, and more people do that, and I think the more likely that we can actually, you know, change the system, so to speak, even though we, you know, a lot of people are very disappointed and think that we are powerless, but hopefully that's not the case. We are powerful, come on.
One thing that might, I think, in the long run, help readdress some of the balance here is that we're trying to, in terms of research culture, we're trying to move away from models of like single heroes and single labs and, you know, one university is fantastic. And there's much more interest and emphasis on collaborative research. So I think in the future, it will actually be really beneficial for an institution and a lab to be seen to be actively collaborative. And the broader the collaborations and the more varied and diverse they are, that's going to be seen as like a status symbol, is look how impressive our collaborations are, and moving to these big consortia. And I think, I mean, there's a rather distasteful way of thinking about diversity is how it actually benefits the majority stakeholder at the moment. So we can talk about diversity as being better for the powerful ones because it increased the robustness of our product. You know, the more diverse the voices, the more robust the conversation we'll be having or the problem that we'll be solving. So it's kind of instrumentalizing the value of diversity. And if we talk about that in terms of diversity and collaboration, again, it will be powerful, it will be valuable for an institution or an individual lab to have diverse collaborations. And that way they might bring some more power to researchers in the global south. So for example, if it's this beneficial status thing to say, look at all these institutions I'm collaborating with in Mexico, in any other country. But in order to do those collaborations successfully, you'll have to actually resource and give power to those other places. So I think we can maybe expect these collaborative models to involve a wider sort of global perspective. And then we'll have to, in order for those collaborations to be actually working, we'll have to push to resource different people. So yeah, I think we can jump on the bandwagon of diversity is a wonderful thing and actually make it work for more people. It's yeah. pushing our own agenda and aligning it with the agenda of the powerful people in a way to make it work for more people. I think is the way I'm going to try and play it anyway.
Yeah, I think Cassandra's words are the best way to finish our session. So our time is off. So I would really like to thank our panelists for your time and the great thoughts and resources you shared with us. And I hope that this session will contribute for further discussion on these topics and improvement in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to find you all on Twitter. Thanks. Bye-bye.